here's the idea, right? So first of all, we need to go through and explain what application registration is, what service principals are, how applications and services actually authenticate in Azure and authenticate to things like Entra. And then what we can do is we can go and build up a PowerShell script and use those kind of concepts to actually get that PowerShell script to control some things in Azure, or more to the point, to interact with some things in the Azure service. If we're doing this via service principals, it means we don't have to do things like embedding user credentials into our PowerShell scripts that are interacting with Azure, because that would be a really, really bad thing to do. So let's get straight into it, and let's go check out the whiteboard and draw out what we're going to do, and then we're going to actually demo it and actually build this thing out, okay? First of all, if you imagine you have Entra ID here, okay? And Entra ID is doing all of your funky authentication for your users and for all the things that you've got running inside Azure. Now, if you have a user, like for example, Bob actually has an account, doesn't he? He has an account in, for example, Entra ID. Now, Bob's account, not Bob the person, is actually the thing that gets permissions to do stuff, okay? So, for example, if we've given Bob the permission to access a certain resource group that has stuff inside it, like virtual machines, and we have used funky things like IAM Permissions to actually give Bob access to that, it's Bob's account that gets given the access to be able to do the thing, all right? Bob is actually authenticating to his account. So Bob the person goes through this authentication process to prove he is who he says he is, maybe with things like multi-factor authentication, and maybe conditional access gets thrown on top of that. That's all cool. But then it's the account that actually gets permission to do the things. The same kind of things happens with applications. So if you've got something like inside Azure, you've got something like a logic app, and I'm going to show you this in a minute. So bear with me a moment. I'm going to show you this logic app working. So if you've got a logic app, and this logic app needs to do something, maybe for example, what you've got, and the example I'm going to give you in a moment, is you've got, for example, a key vault. Now, a key vault stores things. If you haven't checked out key vaults before, think of them like storage accounts, but what they store is they store secrets, they store keys, and they store certificates inside there. And what you can do is you can apply permissions to those things to allow things to read them. So, for example, we could allow Bob the ability to go and read a key vault if we really wanted to. But in this sort of sense, we want a logic app to actually go and do it. Now, the logic app is the application. This is kind of like Bob the person here, okay? So the logic app needs something else. What the logic app has something called a managed, let's try and write this out neatly, managed identity in Azure. Now, a managed identity, okay, this thing, it is actually something else. It's called a service principal. A service principal. There we go. This managed identity that is a service principal is the actual account that this logic app is going to be using, okay? So the logic app itself is authenticated to that managed identity, okay? The reason why it's called a managed identity is because Azure is managing that process for us. This whole authentication piece here, it's done in the background. And this managed ID is sitting on Entra ID as a service principal. Now, what we can then do is we can give that managed identity the ability to go to, for example, a key vault, and maybe, for example, interact and read things inside that key vault. So let's go and have a look at this inside my Azure portal. First of all, we're going to have a look at my logic app. Then we're going to look at my key vault. Then we're going to look at the managed ID. And then we're going to look at the permissions inside here. Okay? So let's go check that piece out first. Okay. So we're over here in the Azure portal. I've got the Azure portal actually open in two separate tabs here for two separate locations. But the first one is we're looking at this Key Vault demo resource group over here. And what we're going to be interacting with is this thing here, this Key Vault demo logic app. So we'll just open that up for the moment. Okay. And inside this Key Vault logic app, this is basically an application. It's an application that's drawn kind of visually. Okay, there's a lot to logic apps. They're very complex. They're great things. But what this is going to do is it's actually going to perform two operations. It's got one operation called get secret, which is going to interact with a key vault inside my environment and going to get a secret. This is also going to do a HTTPS call, which is going to do a REST call, representational state transfer call, to that same key vault and retrieve the same secret, but in a slightly different way. Okay, and if I go and run that, what you'll actually see is you'll see the output. So this secret that it's going to go and get, if I go and open the outputs here, you can see the value of the secret there is Wibble. Okay, I know. And the value of the Wibble the value of the secret down here is also Wibble, but this has been returned as a JSON formatted return because this was a REST API call. So let's go and look at what that was actually talking to. So let's open yet another tab down here and let's go into that key vault. Here is the key vault specifically that it was talking to. This one called Kramik Key Vault. Now, if I go inside here, I've got these keys, secrets, and certificates. So if I go into secrets, you can actually see down here the secret of my secret, which is what that logic app was just talking to. So if I open up my secret, and if I open this show secret value button, you'll see the secret value is Wibble. Now, why do I have access to be able to see that secret in plain text? It's because this account that I'm currently logged in with actually has permission to do so. So if you go back over here, think about what I'm about to show you a little bit like an access control list, and think about these secrets kind of like files, okay? So if you go into access configuration down here, and I go into Vault access policies, this is that same kind of access control list that we've got. And if we look down here, I actually have, let's move me over here to the left for the moment, I actually have Mike admin down here, which is the account that I'm currently logged on as, and this actually has secret permissions of all, okay? So I can go and read, write, do whatever I want to those secrets. You'll also notice there's an application here called Key Vault Demo, which also has the secret permissions of get and list. More tea. Okay, so we've currently seen the Key Vault here, right? And we've seen the logic app, and we've seen the logic app go to the Key Vault and read something. Let's go and look at this managed ID bit to connect that logic app together, okay? So if I go back over here and I drop into Entra, you'll see inside Entra, I've got a bunch of users. These are just normal, bog standard user accounts, all sorts of people down here, okay? Some names you'll recognize, maybe like this one, and this one, and this one, and some recognize that you might not recognize, like this one. Jess Phillips, highly doubt she's actually watching this, but really cool politician. Okay, shout out to Jess Phillips. So if we go back here, if we go into our enterprise applications, and we just take off this thing down here, this is all the applications that exist inside my environment that are communicating to various different things. These are essentially the user accounts for the applications that are running inside Entra and 365. Now, if I go and have a look at for that application Key Vault demo, you can see it right here. Here's the application Key Vault demo. Okay, and I can assign this permissions. You know, I can actually give this account roles and administrator permission. But this here, you can imagine this like the manifestation of a person. Okay, it's not a person, it's an application. We're not getting to that stage with AI just yet. It's coming, I'm sure. So this thing here is actually being given permission to do the tasks on the Key Vault to be able to actually go and read that secret. Okay, cool. So how does that all kind of function? Well, it all based around this kind of connection piece down here. And this connection piece is where stuff kind of starts to get a little bit complex, okay? So what we've got is these various scenarios. So say, for example, what we're going to do is we're going to expand on this process. I'm just going to remove Bob from here, okay? What we've actually got is we've actually got a PowerShell script that we want to run, okay? And what this PowerShell script is going to do is, very simply, it is going to get a list of stuff in Azure, okay? Basically just going to go and get all the information inside Azure. Now, I could do many different things with the PowerShell script, admittedly. I could get it to build stuff, do whatever. This is just an example to show you what it can do. What do we need to do with this PowerShell script? Well, we need to get this thing to kind of connect. Now, our PowerShell script is basically an application like the Logic app. So we need essentially a managed identity. Well, not really. What we actually need is we need a service principal. The reason why this managed identity is called managed, remember, is because Azure itself is controlling this process. So what I need to do is I actually need to go and create a service principal, okay, and a service principal for the PowerShell script that I want to be running on my computer, right? So this is going to be part of Entra ID, just like Bob and the managed ID actually is. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to perform this process to connect that service principal to that PowerShell script, essentially provide an element of authentication, right? So let's start with the first piece. Let's go and create this service principal. And the way I create this service principal is what I actually do is I follow through a process called an app registration. Okay, so let's go check that out in the Azure portal. So bouncing back over here to the Azure portal and bouncing back into Entra. Yes, you can do this from the portal entra.microsoft.com if you want to. I'm just choosing to do it through the Azure portal. And now if I go down into app registrations, okay, what I can do is I can do a new app registration. Now I'm going to call this PowerShell script test. Okay, PowerShell script test. Now, supported account types. Who can use this application or access to this API? If I only want people inside my tenant organization to be using this, then yeah, it's going to be single tenanted. In this case, this is just a PowerShell script that I'm registering. So it's only going to be single tenanted. This is not going to affect multiple people's environments or multiple disconnected environments. I'll explain single tenant, multi-tenant later on. If we're doing a PowerShell script here, we just need a single tenant. Now the redirect URI would be valid if we actually had a web server here, but we don't have a web server. We're going to do a PowerShell script, remember, so we don't need a redirect URI. What that basically means is when you're going to a website, say for example, you're going to, I don't know, let's open a new private window down here. Say for example, you're going to portal.azure.com and you get the Microsoft login box here, right? This here is the Microsoft Identity Service. By going to portal.azure.com as a web app, right, I do this authentication process, and once the authentication is complete, what it does is it talks to the redirect URI, and it says, okay, what do I need to give to the user so the user knows where to go next? So in this case, the redirect URI for this will be portal.azure.com. Now, this is not a problem for us, because we don't have a redirect URI, because we're just going to mess with the PowerShell script. I'm going to show you the script in a bit, so, bear with me. Okay, so we're going to register that application. Now, we don't need all of this. We don't need to understand what all of this actually does. But what we need is we need to kind of make that connection, okay? So Bob here is making his authentication through multi-factor, through passwords, through FIDO2 security keys, whatever it might be, okay? Bob is making some form of authentication. That authentication is being handled in the background here by that Logic app, because it's a managed ID. But what can we use down here for our authentication? Well, there's a couple of ways of doing this, but the easiest kind of ways of doing this is to basically use a couple of numbers. Well, a couple of strings, should I say? Yes, strings would be better use. And those two strings that are actually going to be used is called a client ID and a client secret. Now, if you want to think about these like a physical person, think about it like a username and password, okay? But what we've got down here is inside our Azure, we have our object IDs, our directory IDs, and our application IDs. But notice it says application brackets client ID, okay? So let's go and have a look at the script. Okay, so over here, I have the script that I'm going to use, okay? You can get the script from one of my GitHub repositories. I actually leave it in my AZ104 notes repository if you want to go and grab it. There's a PowerShell version, a Go version, and a Python version if you want. They all work the same. But what we've got here is we've got a few components to the script. Don't worry about what it all does, okay? This first sort of section up here, this is defining the app registration detail. So there is my username and my password, essentially, okay? And there is my tenant, which is where that username and password is valid, because my tenant is where all of my accounts are, all right? And what it's going to use those credentials to go and hit an API, right? It's going to hit this API down here, management.azure.com, and it's going to hit that API, and what we're actually going to do is we're going to go and authenticate to this. So it's going to take this body credential section here, or sorry, this body hash table, take those credentials, put them into the actual $body variable as a hash table, and then pass that as a REST method off to the URL, which is login.microsoft.com, and after the resource, which is going to be management.azure.com. When it goes through this authentication process, it produces something called an access token. This access token is like a Kerberos token in the sense that you've gone through this authentication process to Entra, and Entra provides you with this nice little secret token that you can then provide to other services to say, look, I am authenticated. I do have the permission to access your things. All right. So let's go and have a look at that process first, because we need to kind of do some things to these scripts. First of all, we need to get this bit sorted first, okay? Let's go back to my Azure portal, and let's go grab my tenant ID. Let's copy that, and let's go back into my script, and let's go and paste that into my script. Okay, that's my tenant ID. So what I need to do now is I need to get the client ID. So the client ID is kind of like the username. So let's go grab the client ID down here. And let's go pop that client ID in over here. Okay, there we go. Now I need a client secret. I need a password for this to actually work. So if I pop this up here and I go into certificates and secrets, I can create a new client secret. This is like creating a password. So I'll leave a description here. We'll call it secret. Okay, and it's going to expire in 180 days. That's fine for the moment. Let's go and add that in. There are better ways of doing this with key vaults, but it's a little bit more complicated to what I want to actually demo today. We might get into that later on. So notice my value here. I'm going to copy that value. I have to copy that value now. All right. The reason why I have to copy that value now is if I refresh this page, you'll notice the value gets hidden. You can keep making secrets, but it's not going to display that anymore after the initial kind of display. So if I pop up here into this client secret and I paste that thing in there. All right, cool. So that's given me my username and password, but there's a component that we're missing here, which is this piece, okay? This management.azure.com component. So what do we actually want to do with this PowerShell script? We want to do a get list or get a list of stuff in Azure. Okay, so let's move this down a little bit here just to give a little bit more space, all right? So we've got, for example, our Azure bubble. Remember, our Entra ID is a separate thing. It's an authentication component. So we've got our Azure bubble over here. This is where our infrastructure is running. And inside our Azure bubble, we have a variety of different things. You know, we have our virtual machines, we have our SQL servers, we have our storage accounts, we have all of our stuff and things that we actually want to access. Now, normally what we're doing with that from a day-to-day basis is we're going to use things like the Azure portal to actually go and hit Azure. But there's another component inside here. This Azure portal, if we rewind it a little bit, is not actually directly hitting Azure. What the Azure portal is doing is it's actually going to hit an API, okay? And that API is going to interact with the rest of Azure. Essentially, the Azure portal has permission to go and communicate to the API and do things like list information out, as long as the appropriate person logging into that portal has the permission to do it. So what we need to do is we need to actually give this PowerShell script permission to do this, and to do that, it's not the PowerShell script we need to mess with. What we actually need to do is we need to mess with the service principal. So the service principal here, this thing, we are going to give permissions to essentially go and read information from that API, right? Because otherwise this isn't going to work. This API here is represented in the code, where are we? In the code by this component here, management.azure.com. There's actually multiple APIs. So management.azure.com is the API that's actually used for communicating to Azure resources in the infrastructure, if, for example, you were writing a script to communicate to Entra, you actually communicate to a different API. You've actually got something called the Graph API. And the Graph API is used to communicate normally with things inside Entra ID and the things inside Microsoft 365. So you want to go and write scripts to retrieve people's emails, that sort of stuff. You go via the Graph API. But you want to go and mess about with things inside Azure, you go via the Management API. Okay, there's a few other APIs as well. So let's go back to our service principal and let's go make that read process actually happen. Okay, so we made this connection, we've made this authentication because we've added the client ID and the client secret and the tenant, but now we need to give it permission to do things. Okay, cool. So let's go back to the portal and do that. So over here in the portal, we've got our PowerShell script test. And what we're going to do is we're going to go into API permissions. Okay, so at the moment there's Microsoft Graph user.read. That's just defaulted here. That's fine. We don't need that at the moment. What we do actually need is we need to add permissions to this. And if we go to add permissions, we are given a list of APIs here, the various different APIs that are available to us in Azure. So for example, there's an Intune API, a Purview API, Azure Data Catalog API. There is even somewhere down here, there we go, the Azure Quantum API. That's going to be the next big thing. I'm telling you, in like 3 years, you won't be hearing AI. You'll be hearing quantum. That will be the next big buzzword, guaranteed. Somebody come back to me in 3 years and tell me if I'm right. If somebody's watching this in 3 years, which I hope you are, hashtag like and subscribe. So yeah, there's the Microsoft Graph. We don't want to do this. What we want to do is we want this one, Azure Service Management, okay? And if we choose Azure Service Management, you have this permission called user impersonation, okay? You've got to add that permission in. And if you add the user impersonation permission in, what that does is allows us to talk to things inside Azure. So if I go and grant admin consent for that, this is just going to make sure that these permissions here, this user impersonation permission and this user.read, technically I don't need the user.read, but this user impersonation permission is given to this PowerShell script, and this PowerShell script doesn't need to go and claim it. That's a whole other process. We'll talk about that later on when I do another demo later on with a Flask application. So in the future, guys, we are going to do a graph demo over here, and we're actually going to use a PowerShell Flask application to explain that piece. But we're sticking with PowerShell scripts at the moment, okay? So what do we need to do now? Okay, so that bit's completed. Let's go check if the authentication actually functions and works. So let's go back over here. Let's go back into app registration, okay? And let's go run some components of this script. I'm not going to run the whole script because there is going to be a problem. Some of you may have foreseen the problem, but we'll get in and fix it in the moment. So let's go and run this block at the moment. Okay, let's just go run tenant ID, client ID. Let's go check that this actually functions. Let's go run F8 on that one. Okay, that's cool. So now if I run $access token over here, we should find that $access token contains our token. Now our token is coming back as base 64 encoded, but if I use this nice little bit of code here, and go and grab that, copy that, go and paste this in, that decodes that token for us. So what you can actually see is you can see the API that it's connecting to, and you can actually see things like the ID number. And we can also see some older stuff like sts.windows.net, because that domain is still used quite intensively by Azure from a very, very long time ago. And we can see this is actually an ID type of an application. Okay, so that's cool. So that means the authentication is functioning, and we are given an access token. And we can give this access token to other things to gain access to things. Cool. So let's go back over here and let's run another component of this script. So down here, what we've got is we've got a little bit of a validation to make sure the token's been retrieved, which it has. There we go, access token obtained correctly. And then what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and access my subscriptions. So there's a few components to this. Look, there is this section down here that says subscriptions, which is doing an invoke REST method, get URI subscriptions URI, and expand property value down there. Now, I've got multiple subscriptions in my environment. So what this is basically going to do is extract both subscriptions in my environment. What we're then going to do is write those subscriptions out, okay? And if we go and run that, it comes out with subscriptions found nothing. Now, there's a good reason for this, Okay, very good reason. So what we've actually done so far is we've actually given this PowerShell script and this service principal read permissions to the API. But it doesn't have the ability to actually look at anything, right? I mean, imagine it this way, okay? Imagine it like if it's Bob. So Bob the user, okay? And we've been through this before with role-based access control. But if you take, for example, Bob the user, and Bob accesses the Azure portal, he doesn't necessarily have access to see everything inside of Azure. We have to give him IAM permissions to go and see and do the things that he needs to actually do. So it's the same thing with these PowerShell scripts. We need to give this service principal the ability to go and actually read all the information inside Azure. Not only is the ability to do service management part of this process, we need to provide these read permissions. So to do that, what we're going to need to do is drop back into the portal again. And in the portal, what we're going to do is we're going to go and drop into my management groups, okay? Now, I've got multiple subscriptions here. I've got Visual Studio A and Visual Studio B subscriptions. I want this PowerShell script to kind of interact with both of those subscriptions. In fact, I want it to list out information of everything inside Azure. So to do that, I need to give it kind of control of all the subscriptions and therefore all the stuff. So if I come here into the tenant root group, I can go into the access control management for the entirety of my Azure infrastructure. And what I can actually do is I can give role assignments. So say, for example, I might want to give Bob the ability to manage things. That's great. I can give Bob's account here. But remember, this is for a script. And if we go and add a role assignment down here, you can see these are the individual role assignments we've got. So there's owner, so we can allow the script to do anything. Be very careful with that, especially with scripts. I've got job function roles. I just want reader. I just need readability here. So we're going to choose reader. And we're going to choose user, group, or service principal. So remember, service principals and managed identities are basically the same thing, apart from the fact that managed identities are service principals that are automatically connected to applications by Azure, okay? But we did this manually, so this is needing a service principal. Now, if I select members, what I've got down here on the list, if you look, is I've actually got all the lists of users down here. It doesn't show me my service principals, but they are there. You've just got to know what the name of it is. The interface is a bit crappy. So if we go to PowerShell, there we go. I've got PowerShell script test. There's the service principal that we created. That's what I want to give permission to. So we'll give PowerShell script test, go next on that one, the reader process, or the reader role, and we'll make this permanent. I won't use any PIM or anything there, and we'll just go and review and assign that. Okay. Now that PowerShell script test there, you'll see, is listed as a service principal and has this reader role. So let's give this just a couple of minutes to catch up with itself, and we'll try and rerun the script again. Because remember, when you're doing things in Azure, things aren't exactly instant a lot of the time. Okay, so now we've waited a couple of minutes. Let's go and run this block of code again for get all subscriptions. Run F8 on that one. Oh, nothing. Run F8 again. Execute that. There we go. We can see it's listed both of my subscriptions. So now I know I've actually got the read permissions, which means the rest of the script is going to function, which is nice. So to do that kind of process, what's happened is it's done this invoke REST method, but it's provided the access token, that nice super secret access token that's now stored on my computer that's being passed to Azure. So now I've got this nice little block of code, and what this is going to do is literally run through both of those subscriptions within this for each loop, and it's going to go and select all of the resources within those subscriptions and list them out for me. It's going to display those results nicely. So if we go and run this block here, this should go off and fetch all of those resources. That's cool. And then I can go and display those results with this $all resources. There they all are. With a little bit of extra information down here to count the resources by location and by subscription. So do a bit of a count operation here, and then go and display that as a summary table to make it look pretty. There we go. So there is UK South, US, West Europe. There's where all my stuff actually currently is dotted around the world. Now this is a PowerShell script, but this PowerShell script is just using standard HTTPS REST methods to make these calls and interact with Azure because we've given it the permission to do so. It doesn't have to be this way. We can use other things too. So if, for example, I go over to here's an example of it running in Python. So I need to go and change my information around again. I need to make sure that this Python has the right tenant ID, which it should do. And I need to make sure that it has the right client ID and the right client secret. So let's go in here. The client ID is that to make the connection. And the client secret is this, which is the super secret password. Okay. Don't put these client secrets into GitHub. Very bad idea. Okay, it's essentially putting your password in plain text into GitHub. Yeah, you don't want to go doing that. So now if I just go and save this file down here, I should have Python running on here. I can go and run Python app reg demo. And go and execute that. Whoopsie. Let's just go ls. Where am I? PWD. I'm in the wrong folder. So I need to go into CD fun demos down here. And now I can go and run that command properly. So I can go to Python and I can run app reg demo and you'll see the output here and it's exactly the same. Comes out looking a little bit different because it is Python. And that's how it all functions in Python. Again, this is all available on my GitHub. Just to prove the point again, let's do it in GoLang. Here's the same thing in GoLang. Okay, exactly the same process. It doesn't matter what language you're using because this is a REST API. And again, let's go and put that same information in. Let's go and take the client ID. Let's go and put the client ID inside here. And let's go and take the client secret. Let's go grab that. And let's put the client secret inside here. Okay. And let's go and save this process over here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go and run this with GoLang. So let's clear that. And we'll just do go run. And then we'll go and run this file, which is called /app-reg-demo.go. Let's go and apply that. And there is exactly the same thing running in GoLang. But things are a little more complicated in GoLang. Right, so what we've done here, just to conclude, is we've taken our PowerShell script, okay? And our PowerShell script, we authenticated it to a service principal. When we did an app registration, that service principal got created, but we connected it up with a client ID and a client secret. We then gave that service principal the ability to go and talk to the Azure Management API. We then also gave that service principal read permissions over the entirety of my Azure subscriptions, so it could be able to execute and read out and therefore list all the stuff that was in all the stuff that was in my Azure subscription. So I hope you enjoyed that extended demo about how app registration works, about how client IDs and client secrets work, how to be able to actually use that information to write a very basic PowerShell script that you can then extrapolate yourself to be able to then go and read and manipulate resources inside Azure automatically. And you know the routine, #like and subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed this video and will join me next time. Goodbye.